Hello and welcome to Fintech Chatter, brought to you by Tier 1 people, leaders in Fintech executive search. I'm your host, Dexter Cousins. It's a very special episode as we celebrate our 100th show. And to commemorate such an occasion, I'm joined by the godfather of Fintech, Brett King. We're going to avoid talking about Fintech today and instead talk about Brett's new book, co-authored with Dr. Richard Petty, called The Rise of Techosocialism. The book examines how the 21st century is going to be the most disruptive, contentious period humanity has ever lived through. Our most sacred ideologies around politics, economics, and social constructs are being challenged. And this book examines how technology can be a force for good. Tune in for a fascinating discussion on how our careers will evolve in the next decade as AI and blockchain begin to dislodge business models and jobs. And make sure you listen to the end to be in with a chance of winning a signed copy of The Rise of Techosocialism. But before we chat to Brett, we've just kicked off the search for a career-defining chief executive role. I'm looking for someone passionate about Australian fintech with meaningful connections across the ecosystem, including regulators, investors, policymakers, and startups. This is a genuinely amazing opportunity, which could be the perfect start to 2022. So get in touch on LinkedIn if you'd like to be considered. Well, Brett, welcome to a very special episode 100. Great to have you back.
I'm delighted to be here, Dexter. Thanks for having me, as usual.
How have you been since we last spoke? Because I think we were celebrating Moven's 10-year anniversary last time you were on the show.
Oh, that's right. And I had the 2 broken elbows, I think. Yeah, or maybe it was around that time. But no, good. I had I had intended to move to Bangkok and base my residence out of there, but of course the pandemic has threw that into chaos. I have spent a good part of the year in Thailand this year, mostly just finishing off and writing the book, doing edits and stuff like that, getting it ready for release. But I'm back in New York now for the book launch. Hope to get out to Australia now that the lockdowns are opening up to see some family down there.
You can come anywhere except WA.
There you go.
Yeah,
I don't know if I want to go to WA.
Yeah, they
the joke about WA, right? When you go from Melbourne or Sydney to WA, you cross the border, you got to set your watch back 3 hours in 10 years.
I'd not heard that one, but it's a good one. Well, you mentioned there the book. I think we kind of did very kind of briefly cover it when you were last on the show, and it was it's kind of the magnus opus, I guess, in that you've got all the way finished, and then essentially COVID happened, and a lot of the kind of theories that you had were actually becoming reality, and so it was, hey, now we need to change things. Do you want to tell us a little bit just around the kind of background of the book?
Absolutely. Thank you. It's called The Rise of Technosocialism, How Inequality, AI, and Climate Will Usher in a New World. Or just The Rise of Technosocialism for short. And yes, you're absolutely correct. The pandemic actually forced Dr. Richard Petty and I, Richard's my co-author, to rewrite the book a couple of times. Because
Richard was going to be here with us, but we've had some technical issues, unfortunately. Yeah. So Richard, we'll kind of definitely cover your areas of the work as well.
Absolutely. And so the real, I guess, issue there was we saw clear evidence of the fact that global coordination is a necessary function of the global economy. Global collaboration and coordination, not just in respect to supply chain and commerce, but in terms of regulation. And, clearly the effort to create a vaccine that works for everybody. It was a global effort, even though it might have been fragmented a little bit. And so when we look at things like climate change and regulation around AI and the transition to highly automated societies, again, we argue in the book that we're going to have to collaborate increasingly. One area to illustrate is, a national climate change policy. Obviously, there's a lot of criticism right now on the Australian government in respect to that and the use of renewables and all of those things. But understand that there's no such thing as a national climate change policy. The problems that we face in respect to the climate or will face are a global problem. And so if you have one country that's really doing a phenomenal job on climate, and then another country is doing a terrible job on climate, then we're not going to get to the solution we need, right?
So you've written many books on banking and fintech. What was it that got you to, or made you kind of change the focus and go a lot broader?
Actually, my first book I wrote, which I never published, was a science fiction book. It was called Mars Desert Fire, which was basically a story about colonization of Mars and how Mars trying to get independent from Earth and so forth. But, I've always been a frustrated sci-fi author in that respect. And so, a lot of people refer to me as a banking futurist, but it's probably more accurate or at least I like to think of myself as a futurist first and an expert or domain expert in banking second. Because, the one thing about futurists is we're in a hurry to get to the future. That's how we sort of live our life. We're always looking at technologies or, societal changes, economics, et cetera, that's going to get us to that place of potential that the future has. And so in that respect, I feel I'm a futurist. And my job is really to help people prepare for that future. Now, obviously, I've invested a ton of time in the banking space because I have domain expertise there. But I think it was also time I felt like I'd had a pretty good shot over the last 10, 11 years in terms of, transforming the banking space and making people aware of the issues in that. And I thought it was time for me to tackle something a bit meatier, something a bit more meaningful for the planet and for the species.
Yeah. It's very, very thoroughly researched. Where did you go for the research?
I did all the research myself. We started with various theses. I mean, how the book actually started is Richard and I got in a room in Sydney, actually, with a whiteboard and just mapped out some of the core issues. And one of the core ways of sort of framing this is, what are the potential future states of mankind? Or because this book really it's a book about philosophy of the human species, really, but we look at socio-political, socio-economic organizing principles. How do we organize society today? How does society function, from a social cohesion perspective, economics perspective, and so forth? And where does the current problems that we see in these future crises lead us? And so we had to sort of try and find a way to frame that. And ultimately, what we came up with on the whiteboard that day was, the biggest problem today, one of the biggest problems today we face is inequality. And the pandemic accentuated inequality. So how do we solve inequality? So one of the axes is inclusion or collectivism, right? And so you have on the top of the axis, inclusive societies, collective policy, et cetera. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have exclusionary economies and very individualistic societies, so where individualism is valued over the whole. And then on the other axis of this four-quadrant sort of future, we have planned positive outcomes and chaotic dystopian, so planned utopian, chaotic dystopian. Yeah. And so we then fitted four models into that we saw as likely. And what would be the key drivers for that. And from there, then started to research each of those specific elements where, for example, what paradigms or templates do we have based on historical events, previous analogies, what we've seen in terms of human behavior in the past, and how will that apply to the future, and where we need to change that in respect to producing the most optimal outcome for humanity as a species, the planet as a whole.
So what are these four kind of potential future states that you kind of predict or foresee?
So on the chaotic future side, on the inclusive side, you have where we have rejection of technology and science more broadly. And the reason for this, we've seen a little bit of pushback against the vaccine, for example, in Australia and the US. But imagine where artificial intelligence is really, creating destruction of jobs and employment. So you have large-scale technology and unemployment emerging. So one of the strategies might be in that scenario to say, all right, let's ban artificial intelligence because it's just taking humans out of the workforce. And this would happen in particular if there was a rejection of the concept of universal basic income as a standard, as an example. Right? If you're in an economy where the political forces say there's no way we're going to pay for that, we can't afford to pay for universal basic income, then you have to ultimately ban artificial intelligence, because at the heart of artificial intelligence is getting rid of human labor. That is the purpose of AI. And so AI has massive potential to disrupt labor participation in respect to classic supply and demand. So, that's one of the potential outcomes of banning AI. So we call that the ladder stand scenario, where there's a broader rejection or a massive slowdown of technology from disrupting society because of the ill effects. Then you have where we just wait too long. Right. So the chaotic future is because we just can't get our act into gear. And so that is what we call fail to stand. Collections of failed states. You can't get consensus. Again, we're starting to see this already, where you have various governments around the world that can't form majorities. They can't get laws or budgets passed because there's just not consensus. So you apply that out to issues like climate change, and climate accentuates that, AI accentuates that, and you get to sort of where the system just breaks down. Yeah, it doesn't necessarily break down globally, but it will break down at an individual economic level. And then on the positive or the planned future side, you have the exclusionary model, which is what we call neo-feudalism. So it's essentially where corporations get more and more control, and the gap between the rich and the poor continues to grow. Yeah. That sort of gets baked in permanently as a feature of human society. And so the rich get all the best tech. They get longevity treatments, which extend their lifespan. The poor, don't get subsistence payments in terms of, lack of employment. And, we have people starving, food scarcity issues, all of those things. But, basically the mantra is, what if you don't work hard enough, then, you deserve to die because, that's your problem. Instead of society saying, this is incumbent on society or the economy to provide for every citizen at its core. And then, of course, the outcome which we think is most optimal is obviously technosocialism, where we use technology to massively reduce the cost of government, make government and governance much more efficient, and we use that to ensure that every human on the planet, every participant in the economy can have their basic needs met. And then on top of that, we look at the mechanisms that we know in terms of capitalism and so forth to encourage growth. But in doing so, we sort of realign philosophically the economy so that it is focused more on optimal outcomes for everybody in society rather than just for a select few, the richest.
Yeah. Now, Dr. Richard Petty, he's really put the kind of economic weight behind this research as well. So it's not just science fiction idealism. There's a lot here that's gone into, hey, well, what would these actual, how would this work? If we look at the world today, which one do you think is most likely to come true when you kind of look at that quadrant that you've got?
It depends on where you're at. Which economy you're in. But in Australia, the UK, and the United States right now, neo-feudalism is essentially where we're going, right? Which is corporations get to set policy. So, for example, fossil fuel companies are dictating policy when it comes to renewable energy. You have huge amounts of wealth capture. So the world's billionaires during the pandemic, their wealth surpassed $10 trillion for the first time. US billionaires alone, $1.6 trillion in wealth. And they have this massive wealth, but that's not efficient in terms of its allocation from a resource perspective. And so increasingly we see the stratification of society. The middle classes of UK, Australia, and the US are all shrinking right now. We're having a lot more people end up at the bottom of the pyramid, and it's only the people that own, are involved in capital markets or own large amounts of property and so forth, for example, that sort of can stay in that wealthy segment. And we, as a result, increasingly we have problems with people making a living wage. Or in the United States, we have homelessness increased by 6,000% during the pandemic. You've still got 30 million Americans that could be evicted as a result of not paying rent during the pandemic. We have some really serious functional issues at an economy level.
Yeah. We're in the midst of a talent and skill shortage, yet in the book you predict up to 50% of the US workforce could be potentially out of a job. How come? What got you to that conclusion?
Well, there's various pieces of research in respect to artificial intelligence and its impact on the workforce. But again, we come back to the basic principle. Artificial intelligence, the purpose of AI, while we talk about super intelligent AIs being able to solve the problems of the universe, for example, the core purpose of artificial intelligence has always been to produce more productive economies and eliminate humans from the workforce through automation. And so that is the goal of artificial intelligence. So you can't integrate at some point, AI is going to displace humans from the workforce. Now, the argument is yes, but we'll create more jobs for humans. And we have some historical evidence for that, like the dot-com boom, for example. And ironically, during the Tronics boom of the 60s in the US, the dot-com boom in the 90s, we had both labor shortages for these new technology arenas and increasing unemployment. And so because the skills don't match the emerging economy. So you can have both. You can have labor shortages and you can have people being unemployed because they don't have the right skills. But ultimately, the artificial intelligence is really the goal of AI is to eliminate work for humans. Or how we frame it in the book is you now be able to choose what you do every day that you're passionate about instead of having to do a job that puts food on the table. That's ultimately the shift that where AI takes us. And sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Brett. Yeah, I was just going to say it's and I just wanted to make this point because I was actually on I think TV about 6-7 months ago, and they were talking about the skill shortage here in Australia, and I'd made the point that yes, there is a skill shortage, but exactly as you said, there's not the match. And the point I made was that what we'd seen as COVID hit was that a lot of the offshore centers had been brought onshore in tandem with partnerships with AI businesses that were now sitting with these people, predominantly in customer service, etc., working on AI solutions, and essentially, those people training the AI. I can't help but think that this kind of whole narrative around the Great Resignation is being pushed by corporates who now don't have to pay massive redundancies and payouts to people that they then finally replace with AI.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought of that, but that has some merit to it, that line of reasoning. In the book, we talk about universal basic income, which so many entrepreneurs, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Richard Branson, Jeff Bezos, et cetera, Mark Zuckerberg, have talked about previously and supported, because they all realize that their companies, their organizations are going to be employing less people in the future for the same sort of returns that we see today. In fact, 9 out of 10, the 10 largest companies in the world today have dramatically lower numbers of staff for the same capital, capital production or output rather that they have. And so, they're getting much higher profits per employee because they're employing less people. So that is the overall trend. So then how do you pay for UBI? Well, you could do it by taxing robots or algorithms. You could do it by demanding these corporations who are going to be accumulating massive wealth because of the use of AI, that they create job programs for every human that they displace. You could use the wealth that AI creates to support that. There are a few different mechanisms you could deploy for this.
We've seen it to an extent, I guess, over the last 12 months, Brett, with all the government stimulus and incentives around.
It's a great example of
that we had. Yeah. What it's kind of led to is we're now seeing on the back of that this great resignation crisis that we're talking about. Do you think that a universal basic income creates productive societies, or does it just make us lazy and unproductive and uncreative?
There's sort of two binary outcomes for this. If you don't have UBI, people starve and die, right? In a highly automated society. So it's not really reasonable, at some point, the argument of whether or not UBI creates productive citizens is sort of a moot point, because if you have no social safety net and you have massive unemployment, you'll have social unrest and revolution. So, one of the chapters in the book we call Revolution Risk Management, for that purpose. But the UBI trials, and we looked at about 70 UBI trials around the world, and the UBI trials do not demonstrate that outcome. They don't demonstrate that people get lazy and sit on their couch in the metaverse all day, right? Generally speaking, more people go out and start their own businesses, more people get involved in community projects, and people are more active than they would be on classic unemployment benefits. And so that's an outcome we didn't expect to see, but we have seen from UBI trials around the world. Having said that, one of the things you can do to mitigate that risk is you can link the access to UBI to some sort of core social program. So, for example, the biggest issues we have: inequality, homelessness, poverty, and certainly climate change emerging. People have to do 2 years of national service, as an example, to qualify for lifetime supplements to their income through universal basic income. So those 2 years of national service would be involved in things like building seawall defences around Sydney Harbour so it's not flooded by sea rise, making retooling the energy infrastructure of the Australian market for total renewables, including battery storage, carbon sequestration, carbon extraction programs, et cetera, and so we propose funding part of that, at least, out of forgiveness for national debt. So we propose globally that national debt is forgiven, and those funds are put in a pool for access to these types of global mitigation climate issues.
Awesome. Now, you're, I guess, the third guest that we've had on that I would say is kind of, an original gangster of the fintech scene, a real early kind of innovator and pioneer. And all three of you are now moving very much into, these world issues that we need to deal with around climate change, universal basic income. We're seeing now as well across the next group of innovators coming through, particularly in the crypto space, where we've got the emergence of DAOs. And I wondered, when I start to read some of these, particularly the technosocialism outcome that you've defined, whether you're seeing with the emergence of DAOs, maybe as a platform or a construct by which we could actually make technosocialism a reality.
Absolutely. In fact, government should be a DAO. Right? That's ultimately what we argue in the book, is if you want the most efficient form of government, you have to have a highly automated resource allocation. And in doing so, you dramatically reduce the cost of government. But what it also means is you have to change representative government itself. You have to have different consensus building mechanisms. And essentially the government that gets voted in is there as an administrator of the autonomous function of government rather than, being about policy setting and so forth. Because ultimately policy setting becomes code when you talk about highly automated societies. And so it's pretty interesting to sort of think about how government could change. But one example we use is virtual Taiwan, a mechanism created by the Taiwanese government to reach consensus on a number of issues. And they found that by giving people a platform, that it was actually more efficient at creating policy outcomes than having representative governments argue it out on the floor of the parliament, for example. So yeah, government should totally be a DAO.
When I looked at one of the other outcomes, the neo-feudalism one word sprung to mind: meta. With the metaverse, there's a lot of talk. A lot of people are getting excited. I think there's some elements that get me excited, but as a bit of a sci-fi nut myself, there's this part of me that's thinking, this is just, it does not feel right. Have I just watched too many sci-fi movies? Am I just thinking that we're going to kind of be in this dystopian future where everybody's obese lying on a bed, but living this fantasy life in a metaverse?
In a world where everyone has a VR headset. Yeah, exactly.
I can't use VR headsets to make me feel sick, right? Yeah. I get motion sickness.
Well, that tech will improve, and it will eventually become, indistinguishable from reality, as bastardizing a Arthur C. Clarke quote. I think things like the metaverse were always fairly inevitable.
Yeah.
And, what we've seen during the pandemic is we've seen, alternate forms of entertainment and content delivery start to replace traditional forms. So, people are sitting on TikTok and YouTube and stuff like that rather than watching, Channel 9 News or Fox News.
Yeah.
Those viewerships are dwindling. But that's created a problem of tribalism and things like that. But where, again, where VR or the VR space or the metaverse could work is, you create places for people to be in their tribes and feel comfortable at home and so forth and play out those fantasies in that world. It probably won't be healthy, right? But there's also what we think is that there will at some point be a clash of virtual versus reality, where people then go back to saying, no, we want to experience real life. And part of the freedom that something like UBI would give us is, for example, the ability to travel and work from home work from anywhere. And we saw that potential during the pandemic. And so if you want to go and work around the world, maybe you want to go and work on the polar ice caps in terms of preventing, glacial melt and stuff like that. It's like, you could do that while doing your side gig, or your work, and you got UBI and you do the side gig to, pay for your travel or whatever it is. Right. So we sort of think that VR is obviously part of the makeup, but there's so many things that technology will allow us to do in this century that it does broaden our horizons as a species. For example, mining asteroids and colonizing Mars and going back to the moon. These are sort of crazy goals that we've always dreamed of in terms of science fiction, but we now have the technical ability to do that. It's only just a matter of cost right now. So when you reframe economics to be about sort of optimizing humanity, then some of these things may get better priorities. Certainly after you solve problems like homelessness, poverty, hunger, and so forth, then it's like, what do we do next as a species?
Yeah. To get to, I guess, the outcome of technosocialism, do you think we're going to have to go through wars and real hardship globally, or do you think there's a way where this can be done peacefully and constructively?
So at the very last chapter of the book, we put sort of the roadmap to technosocialism, and we have these.
Well, don't share it, right? Don't share it.
No,
we've got to give them a cliffhanger.
Exactly. There's these distinct outcomes, those 4 outcomes we talked about, and we actually identify the inflection points or the forks in the road, which could take us down one path versus another. Right. For example, banning AI. Already talked about that earlier. So if we decide globally to ban AI, it's going to put us on a particular trajectory. So there are certain inflection points coming up in human history. For example, when the Chinese economy surpasses the US economy, I think it's not difficult to predict that the US is going to find this very difficult to deal with ideologically. And so the first thing the US will probably say is this is fake news, right? These numbers aren't real. China is not really the biggest economy. But when it becomes clear that China is actually, much bigger than the US economy, what are their options? Well, it could be military blockades. It could be they try and put sanctions in through the UN. It'd be very difficult given China's on the Security Council, but they could try measures like that to try and stop China's progress rather than address the deficiencies in their own system. So that's definitely possible, but hopefully cooler heads will prevail. Where this really sort of comes to a head is through climate. Because the biggest problem we have that's going to result from climate is displacement of what we're calling eco-refugees. So some people say now there's between 25 million and 65 million eco-refugees already on the planet. These are people that have been displaced by changing farming conditions, agriculture and so forth has already shifted. And then by 2050, you have 570 coastal cities around the world that are affected by sea rise. Bangladesh, Maldives, Tuvalu, Tonga, they're all underwater. 80% of their infrastructure decimated by sea rise. You have somewhere between, at the low end of the estimate, 300 million eco-refugees, and at the high end of the estimate, 1 billion eco-refugees. So just think about the 5 million refugees that came out of Syria during the civil war there, and then amplify that to 1 billion people, and you realize we can't just ignore this problem. We can't say we need tougher borders, because there's never a proposition where you can secure your border against 1 billion people, right? And so ultimately we're going to have to deal with this problem and say, what do we do about these people as a species? It's not reasonable to just let them die because of decisions that industrialized nations made in the 20th century in terms of carbon output. That's just not a reasonable, plausible situation. And it's quite possible that the global organizations that we already have will place that responsibility economically on countries like Australia, the US, the UK, India, and China, because of our high carbon output per capita, and saying that you guys did this, so now you've got to be a part of the mitigation response. This is really where, from a functional governance perspective globally, we need to come together and really solve these problems. We have piecemeal efforts at this right now with climate change, like the Scotland COP26 just last week. But ultimately, the scale of these deficiencies in governance will be so great that it forces us to act together. If not, 1 billion people could die. And that's not a viable or reasonable outcome for the species, because if that happens, then ultimately future crises, if we follow that same rule, then we really have a very significant threat to the species as a whole and other species on the planet.
Yeah. And I guess we should be encouraged by what we've seen the last 18 months, right? The world has combined to create an antidote to a virus that promised to kill far fewer people than 1 billion, right? And I think this is, we always, certainly I always kind of tend to think of a dystopian and distrusting view of governments, but we have seen there's been a way where they can work together.
Yeah. And there was huge economic incentive for that. right? I think, but also what we saw during the pandemic, look at the clear skies we had for the first time in New Delhi for years, the water being clear in, the Venice channels. We did dramatically reduce carbon output because everyone stayed home. Now, there's a pretty good argument for working from home, right? As part of the mechanism of society. So we can make adjustments that have real material, changes.
Fantastic. Now, I want to talk a little bit about careers in a techno-socialist world. Look, you're somebody who I kind of really admire in, who I would say is a careers futurist, just in the way in which you've navigated your own career and kind of, reinvented yourself and created all of these different facets to, your career itself. Launching businesses, being an entrepreneur, being an author, being a consultant, being a thought leader, being a media kind of mogul in many respects as well. What do you see as the kind of typical corporate career that we have now that is definitely it's been on the wane for the last decade at least? What do you see that kind of morphing into as we go into this techno-socialist world?
Well, I think particularly for our children, they're going to have to be highly adaptable. So the ability to learn new skills and change their, career, the concept of a lifelong career, unless you're an AI specialist or a robotics specialist, I don't think you're going to have a career that's going to survive disruption. I mean, every industry you look at, let's look at truck drivers, going to be disrupted by AI, autonomous driving. Let's look at medical fields. Diagnosis is going to be done by AI. Surgery is going to be robot assisted. Pretty much every, supply chain, we're going to deliver groceries with a robot, right? So pretty much every job you can think of is going to be disrupted in some way. And so the flexibility or adaptability to learn new skills that have greater value in the 21st century economy is always going to be something that's valuable. So the ability to learn, the ability to adapt is key. This requires sort of a lifelong learning commitment. It requires curiosity. It requires the ability to absorb new information and challenge your own ideals, things like that. That's all going to be pretty important. But at the core, we do need to restructure the economy. And so education is absolutely key, changing education. Right now, education is one of the biggest industries in Australia. But I can tell you right now, people going into financial services programs at UNSW or Melbourne University, there's probably a 50% chance that when they come out of their degree, especially if they do a master's over 4 years, there's a very high degree of high possibility that they're going to come out where they don't have a job based on the degree they've just done. So unless they supplement that with deep learning or some other core capability that the industry is going to use, then it's a problem. So fixing our education system so it is making students that are 21st century ready should be a national priority in Australia and certainly in the United States. For every one PhD the United States produces in the STEM arena, China produces 3 right now. And one of the biggest criticisms of both Australia and the US and UK, frankly, in terms of the phenomenal education systems that we do have at the top end is that, we train all these incredible people in terms of scientists and engineers, and they go back to their home country. And so that's keeping those skills in the market in Australia is going to become a competitive differentiator in the future. And I know for many people who, are pensive about the whole immigration issue, understand this, that there is a period of time over the next 20 years where the Australian population will start to shrink without immigration. In fact, if we stopped all immigration today, that would start to happen. And that would have dire economic consequences. China, their population will start to shrink before the end of this decade. Partially, that's the outcome of sort of the one-child policy and not having enough women in their economy. But it's happening. Italy is already in negative population growth. Japan is in negative population growth. The US is going to get there in the 2030s. And so the only way really to create more consumption and economic growth is to have large influx of immigrants in that scenario. So in 20 years' time, we are going to think very differently about immigration. Yeah. We're going to think very differently about education.
Yeah. I actually got the opportunity last week to have a chat with and do a presentation to a bunch of MBA students at AGSM. And they were all very, very interested in a career in fintech. And the main question that I got was, how important is finance experience in fintech? I was like, it's not important at all. What is really important is your ability to be able to, I guess, one, extract data, and then two, analyze that and be able to form decisions based on that. And it was amazing how, when I mentioned SQL and AI and, analysis, like people just didn't contemplate that they were the skills that were required. On top of that, you've got all the entrepreneurial traits that you need to have. But it's becoming more and more imperative. We're seeing even CEOs being put through SQL tests.
All of the fastest growing financial institutions in the world, bar none, are fintechs, right? They're not banks. They're not capital markets companies, unless you call Robinhood, capital market player, right?
Yeah.
All of the fastest growing FIs are based on digital scale, the ability to scale up digitally. So let's take how this might affect the business in the future. So let's take mortgage, because mortgages are critical to the Australian property market. So who is going to be the biggest mortgage seller in 10 years' time? Well, it's the organizations that own the data around the intent to buy a home. Your interest rate isn't important. Whether you're a registered bank or a chartered bank isn't important. The number one seller of mortgages will be contextually based on the fact that I know you're interested in buying a home, and guess what? You've just walked into a property that's listed on a real estate website. Yeah. Here's an offer for home financing. And so, all of those skills that we determined were really critical in the 20th century in terms of mortgage buying and home lending, just not important. Because all of those previous skills we'll already have automated. So then it just comes down to the data. Who wants to buy a home, and what are they doing that leads me to a situation where I can offer them contextually a mortgage?
Yeah. In a techno-socialist world, what do you think is going to be the secret to career fulfillment?
Well, the whole realignment of work comes to be about what you're passionate about. That's the ultimate outcome of techno-socialism, that you get to do something that you really want to do, not because you have to put food on the table, right? That you now can have that ability to explore something that you're passionate about. Or you can go and spend 10 years learning a new craft, so that you can develop or maybe not 10 years, but you can go off on a tangent. You don't have to be committed to something you studied in school and you're stuck in that career. But people can find joy. They can find purpose in what they do. I think that's really the core outcome of techno-socialism if we follow that path. Obviously, you need the right mix of skills in an economy. So there is going to be some alignment of those skills or some value creation system that incentivizes people to go into certain areas. And that may be, an adjustment in terms of the rewards you get. Or let's think about it, the fact that if it's a really vital role in the economy, then of course you're getting income on top of what you might get as a universal basic standard.
Yeah. You've spent a long time on this book, Brett. What's the next subject for you to tackle?
I am right now thinking about how to create either a set of carbon coins or a economic system that on a long-term basis rewards investment by producing or mitigating the effects of climate change. So, for example, cryptocurrencies or tokens that, as the parts per million of carbon reduces in the atmosphere, the currency appreciates, or the asset class appreciates. Or as more and more countries meet their Paris commitments, that the value of the cryptocurrency appreciates. So sort of trying to create an economic mechanism that actually incentivizes us to do the right thing.
Rather than based on the greater fool kind of philosophy that we have now
and one of the core outcomes of the book, which sort of really got me thinking, is what is the purpose of the economy? Yeah. See, economists will tell you it's GDP growth, it's market returns, it's trade balances, all of those things are sort of part of the measures, economic output. But if you measure an economy by how well it looks after its citizens and how prosperous its citizens are, then we are looking at declining performance of economies. From the former perspective, the US post-Second World War economy is the greatest economy the world has ever seen. From the latter perspective, the US is, in terms of looking after the needs of its citizens, it's one of the worst performing economies today.
Yeah.
And so changing that economic outlook to say that, it's not just about the money that the system generates, that it's about the basic needs of citizens being met, is, I think, a really key philosophical point.
Yeah. We're going to wrap up, but before we do, leaving everything on a really positive tone, what's got you excited right now for the future?
I think, look, the potential that AI has to really change human society so that we can explore humanity and that we can fix many of the problems that we have, I think is very clear. But also, I do think that the fact that we were able to get through this pandemic with minimal casualties, if you like, and really come out the other side of this showing that we are highly adaptable as a species, that we can survive these types of crises if we work together, that really gives me some promise. And that's, I think, the core outcome of the book, is that if we want optimal existence for humanity as a species, if we want the best chance to survive as a species and thrive in the future, just sort of like what Aristotle posited, the best chance that we have of doing that is working together. And I think that recent times we've shown that the division that has been sort of artificially manufactured by political commentators and news media platforms and so forth, we can beat that, and we can come together to make a real difference for the human species and the planet as a whole. We just need the intent, and that's the philosophical shift here. Humanity first means everyone. It doesn't mean just a small group of humanity.
Fantastic. Well, it's been great to chat with you about this, Brett. As I said, just as somebody who's deeply passionate about the way in which we work, the way in which society works, the way in which our economy works, it's been just a really, really interesting 45 minutes hearing about everything that you've done. It's just an amazing book. Encourage everybody to get a read of it when they can. Where can people go and buy the book?
So, over the next couple of weeks, we're pushing hard for a New York Times bestseller slot. So if they wouldn't mind ordering off Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com in the US and getting it shipped, that'd be fantastic. But otherwise, of course, it will be available locally through Amazon and through booksellers there. Our publisher is actually based in Singapore, and they have good Australian distribution partnerships. Great. So I guess Dimex and those other platforms will be selling
Fantastic. Well, for the first 10 people who send me an email to info@tier1people.com, let me know what they loved about this show. We're going to send you a copy of the book to celebrate our 100th episode.
That's Brett, awesome, man. Fantastic. And I'll tell you what, I'll send you some signature plates that you can stick in those 10 books.
Fantastic. That would be great. Well, Brett, great to have you on the show. Great to hear that the book's finally out as well. And yeah, we can't wait to have you back on again at some point.
Thanks, Dexter. Have a great week, and congratulations on the 100th show. Well done. A lot of podcasts don't get to that point, so fantastic milestone.
And you can connect with me, Dexter Cousins, on LinkedIn and Twitter. For early access to new shows and updates on the latest exclusive opportunities through Tier 1 people, subscribe to our newsletter by visiting the Fintech Chatter page on LinkedIn. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, remember to press follow on your favorite podcast player, and please consider leaving us a review. It really does help me in bringing in great guests and help fintech fans like you discover the show. Fintech Chatter is presented by Tier 1 people, leaders in fintech executive search. We'll help you launch, scale, and innovate by delivering world-class talent. And you can find out more at tier1people.com. Until the next episode, stay safe